Welcome, everybody, to this session on marketing yourself as a speaker. We are really fortunate today to be joined by JJ Peterson. JJ serves as Chief of Teaching and Facilitation of StoryBrand, as well as the co-host for the chart-topping podcast, Building a StoryBrand with Donald Miller. JJ is a PhD in communication, and prior to joining StoryBrand, he spent the last 20 years before that teaching and practicing communication in the entertainment industry and higher education. He's the co-author of Marketing Made Simple, also the co-host of the new podcast, Marketing Made Simple. And he is someone who I got the lucky opportunity to speak with. I think it was last year, just before or around the time of the pandemic was started. And he had the new book with Don coming out on Marketing Made Simple. Brilliant book, very highly recommended, but of course hard to market when all of a sudden the world turns upside down. But I know you're going to learn a lot. I learned a lot. I took copious amount of notes when I listened back to the podcast episode that I had with him last year. And I know that this is going to be extraordinarily valuable for all of us speakers. And so without any further ado, JJ, so good to see you again. And thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
I'm very excited to be here. So thanks for inviting me.
So would love to start off, if you would be so kind, and just to give us an understanding about, from your perspective, how you got into the whole area of story brand, and tell us a little bit about your background, just so we can sort of chart your story and where that fits with everything.
Yeah, my story, I have, and you'll hear in a minute that I always tell people not to tell their story. So just so you know, I'm going to break the rules as I'm going into this because of to introduce this. But so my background really is in higher education, and I was a college professor, university professor, and worked as dean of students at a university, and also did some acting and directing and screenwriting in Hollywood. And and had been a speaker and entertainer, and actually toured the United States doing improv comedy for 3 years, and toured speaking nationally. So kind of have that in my background. And I was at a university in Southern California, and as you do in Southern California, I sold a reality television show to a production company, and the show was called Bad A Brothers. And the premise was that my actual brothers and I, are so not bad A that we can't even say the word. And so the way that we wanted to become more bad A is by traveling around the country and finding those old weird laws that are still on the books. Like you can't cross the Minnesota border with a duck on your head, or, you can't sleep on top of a refrigerator in Detroit. And so we would research the history behind those old laws, and then we would break those laws to become more bad A. So I
and sorry, just so, because I'm not from the States.
Yeah.
So just to be clear, bad A is badass, right?
Badass, yes,
Okay,
yes.
great.
Which I'm not badass. I am not at all, and neither are my brothers. So
Well, the fact that you said bad A kind of suggests that as well.
A little bit. So I sold the television show, and I was leaving the school, and I decided to invite Donald Miller, who I was a fan of, to the school to speak to my students, kind of almost literally as a farewell to me, present to me. And so I brought him in, and he actually talked about living a great story to my students. And we just became friends, and he was starting this new thing called StoryBrand, where he was moving from teaching people how to live their own great story to how to be a marketer who invited people into a beautiful story to be able to sell their products and services. And so he's like, I've got this workshop. Would you mind, you have a history and story and television and movies. Would you mind coming out and checking it out? And, I said, yeah, I'll come and I'll check it out. And he's like, maybe you can brand your television show. I was like, great. And as soon as I went out to the workshop, I fell in love with the framework that he was using to teach people how to create and use a clear story to market their services. And one thing I didn't mention is I also worked in nonprofit for a while, doing fundraising for, at the time, the largest short-term missions organization in the world. And I had like struggled with creating fundraising letters and websites and campaigns to fund this amazing project. And I just never really knew. I mean, my undergrad degree was in communication, but I was always struggling in how to market. And once I discovered StoryBrand, I like it blew my mind, because it was basically understanding that most companies are so close to their products and services that they have a hard time telling customers what they do in a way that invites them into a beautiful story. And the StoryBrand framework uses story structure, a framework to help people clarify their message so that they can connect with more customers and grow their business. And so I just kind of fell in love with it, and was literally in that moment like, everybody needs to hear this. Everybody who's in marketing, fundraising, anything needs to be able to understand this. And so I started kind of flying back from LA and Nashville, where I was still doing television and movies, and trying to get that TV show off the ground, and then coaching people and teaching people in StoryBrand back in Nashville. And then ultimately, I just decided I want to move to Nashville and do this full time. And so I did about 6 years ago, moved to Nashville, and since then have helped, thousands of companies and individuals help clarify their message and grow their business.
Love it. Thank you very much for sharing that. A lot of stuff I hadn't heard before. So really, really interesting to know that. One of the things that we were talking about just before everyone came in, and I wanted to share with everyone because I wanted to tee it up for the next question is, StoryBrand is extremely simple, but yet it doesn't take away from it. A lot of times there's concepts or ideas that are very easy, basic, and everybody kind of knows. It's common sense. But the beauty of what I've experienced, at least with StoryBrand, I've attended the 2-day workshop in person, was I was very impressed with the way other marketers were talking about it. So these are people who have studied marketing, all these different types, degrees, masters in marketing, as well as people who have been marketing for many years. So it's not so much entrepreneurs, because entrepreneurs can be attracted to different marketing ideas because they're marketed so well to them. But I was watching how marketers responded so well to it. So I'd love if you could, JJ, just give us a brief overview or a brand, like we'll go in depth more into StoryBrand as we go forward, but a brief overview of the StoryBrand method. And most importantly, why is it so effective? Why is it so powerful? Why do people like the likes of yourself, who is a massive interest in terms of story from a scientific point of view, scientific background, why does it resonate for you? But also, why is it so powerful compared to a lot of other ways to promote yourself or market yourself, which are out there?
Yeah. Do you mind if I share my screen? Actually, I just pulled up kind of a thing. We weren't really planned on, I wasn't going to do a PowerPoint presentation, but I'm going to show you guys a couple of things here that will help kind of solidify how it works. So basically, the reason why the story framework is so powerful is because our brain is always trying to do really two things. It's trying to keep us alive, mainly, right? That's the purpose of our brain, is to try to keep us alive. But there's two ways that our brain really does that. And the first is it helps us focus on information that contributes to our survival and thriving. Our brain always is looking for information that will help us survive and thrive. And it's filtering out any information that does not contribute to our survival and thriving. And so, the way that it works is like, if you walk into a movie theater or a Broadway theater, you don't know how many chairs are in the room, but you always know where the exits are, right? Same thing like when you walk into a Starbucks, like you're not stopping and identifying every single thing on the packaging and how many holes are in the ceiling and how many lines are on the floor. But all that information is actually available for our brain to take in. But what our brain does is it goes, well, what's the stuff that I don't have to think about, that I can just put out of the way and I can focus on the things that help me survive and thrive? And our brain naturally does this. And then the second thing that our brain does is that it tries to conserve calories, because when you have to process information and think through a lot of information, your brain burns calories. So that's why, like, if you sit in a meeting all day or you're writing, you're creating a speech, you're being creative, you're exhausted by the end of that. And you go, well, I just sat there all day. Well, you didn't just sit there all day. Oddly enough, you were working out your brain. You were burning calories. And our brain actually has a limited number of decision-making and processing calories at any given time. They're replenishable, like, so they replenish themselves. But at some point, if you keep thinking and processing and working hard with your brain actually runs out of those calories, which is why, like, as a speaker or presenter, you know that if you're presenting for a long period of time, you have to take a break every 90 minutes. And most of us just go, well, that's because people don't want to last long. No, it's actually because their brain stops thinking at around 90 minutes. We run out of decision-making calories. So what our brain naturally does is during the day, humans daydream about 30% of the day. And that's a survival mechanism. It's a way of our brain shutting down the thinking so we can replenish those calories. And the reason it does that is so that, historically and just kind of the way we were made is the idea that if a tiger is going to jump out of the woods at me or the trees at me, and I don't have any decision-making calories left, then I'm dead, right? I won't fight or flight. I will freeze in that moment. And so our brain needs to keep our calories available for the emergency situations. So in order to conserve calories, we're focusing on things that really only pertain to our survival and thriving. And so what you have to do then is basically, when you're communicating, what the StoryBrand framework really purports is, when you're communicating to people, you have to communicate in such a way that shows how what you offer or what you're about to speak on or what you're about to teach on contributes to their survival and thriving, and does so in such a way that they don't have to burn any calories to understand. So that's kind of the first component, is understanding that's how our brain works, is that it's always looking for information that's about my survival and thriving, and in such a way that I can understand it quickly, that I don't have to burn any calories. So what often happens is when anybody puts out any information, you've heard a lot of speakers and presenters, obviously, that they walk away and go, I have no idea what they said, or you don't remember what they said. Well, that's because they typically framed things in a way that did not contribute to their audience survival and thriving, and did not do so in such a way that people didn't have to burn too many calories to understand. So they confuse people, they overwhelm people. And it's true when you're speaking, but it's also really true in marketing. Like when you are marketing yourself as a brand, as a personality, that's how you have to do, because there's so much noise that's out there, like in the marketplace, right? There's so much noise that's going on that the only messages that are actually getting through to people are the ones that people can understand fast and understand how that contributes to their survival and thriving. So then how do you do that? How you do that is through the power of story. And, as speakers, the power of story, right? You tell great stories all the time. But when I'm talking about story, what I'm really talking about is story theory and how story works, because every story is actually a formula. And this formula goes all the way back to even Aristotle and Plato, back in Poetics, where they really helped identify, if you want to change a culture, if you want to move a culture forward, they would argue the best tool you can use to do that is story. But there's a formula to story. And if you break that formula, then people stop paying attention, because our brain has to process the story too much instead of allowing the story to just flow through us. And so that's like what happens when you daydream, is your brain really like enters into a story mode. You start telling yourself a story. But what's interesting is when you read a good book or you go into a movie, if it follows a story formula, your brain no longer daydreams, but it allows the movie, the story that's happening, to do the daydreaming for you. You almost just enter into it. It's a term called narrative transportation. And I'm sorry, I'm getting a little deep on some of this, but I get excited about it. So just go with me and then I promise it gets simple. so, so basically what happens is that movie and story does the daydreaming for us. And we experience what's called narrative transportation. So if you have ever jumped in a movie or like cried in a movie or said like, I got lost in that book, then what you've done is you've experienced narrative transportation. You've allowed the story to essentially do the daydreaming for you. You've entered into that story, placed yourself there emotionally. And so what ends up happening is when the research shows that the better the story, the more the story like sticks together and it tells, like follows the formula that our brain already understands, this formula of story. The more the story does that, the more likely we are to experience narrative transportation. When we experience narrative transportation, the higher level of narrative transportation, meaning the more we put ourselves in the story, the more that that story actually has influence over our thoughts and our actions. That's what the research shows. The better the story, the more narrative transportation we experience, and the more influence then that story has over our thoughts and actions. And this is true in movies and books, but it's also true in marketing. And so like there's research that shows that people can actually experience narrative transportation in as little as an Instagram post or a tweet. So the whole concept behind story brand, and this is, I'm glad this is called Masterclass because we can actually go into the deepness of it. I don't usually go into a lot of this deepness with a lot of people, but why that's all kind of background and important to understand is that when in particular, you are positioning yourself in the marketplace as a speaker, somebody who can come in and have the ability to impact and change an audience, whether that's at a conference or for an individual corporation or entertainment, any of that. When you're marketing yourself in that space, you have the opportunity to tell a story, to invite people into a story, see themselves living a story where you ultimately get to guide them in their journey and help them become who they want to be through the process of hearing you speak. You get to help audiences experience narrative transportation and engage in that through not only when you're on stage, but in your marketing. And so ultimately then what StoryBrand does is understanding that that's how story works. That's how our brains are kind of designed, helping us focus on what's important and do so very clearly. And then that our brains kind of enter into stories and are impacted by stories. What Don has done, Donald Miller, who is the founder and creator of StoryBrand, is he's taken all of the, basically looked at what makes a good story and how does that story impact people. And he's boiled it down to really 7 elements. There's 7 elements of story that every good story you've ever seen has. And these stories help us kind of organize information and do so in such a way that helps people understand what's happening. And so let me just kind of, I'll go through this real quick and then we can kind of go to the next question. I know but this is basically
it's all good. It's all good.
How story works. So in every story, there are really 7 different elements of story. And if you're writing a screenplay, you might have like 32 or different ones, but really when it breaks it down, these are in every story. So the first thing is that in a good story, you have to have a character. And that character, we know very quickly on in the story what that character wants. And it has to be one thing. In order for it to be a clear and good story, the character has to want one thing. Can't want 20 things. Jason Bourne can't need to know who he was and what his history is, and then also open a bakery and run a marathon and get the girl and do all these things. We won't pay attention to that story because it's too many things for our brain to focus on. So there's one clear thing that a character wants. Then the story really the audience gets hooked when the main character encounters a problem. So, Jason Bourne, like he wakes up and he's in the ocean and he's like shot with bullets, but he doesn't know, right? Like that, we're hooked. But if all of, if Jason Bourne is just walking around, eating a pastry, looking at the sunset, like we as an audience will actually only pay attention to that for about 2 minutes. But if what hooks the story and makes the story interesting is a problem occurs. And so the main character has to overcome a problem. And then the entire movie is essentially of that main character overcoming the problem. And then we know instinctively that that hero of the story can't overcome the problem on their own. So they meet a guide who helps them win the day. And, there's a guide in every story. So, in Hunger Games, it's Haymitch is the guide and Katniss is the hero. In Star Wars, Luke Skywalker is the hero, the main character, and Yoda and Obi-Wan are the guides. Gandalf and Frodo, right? There's always like a coach, a mentor, somebody who helps the hero win the day, who then gives them a plan to overcome the problem. Then ultimately there's a moment the hero has to be in or out where the hero is called to action. And then there are stakes in the story. So we know as an audience that these can end in like have a happy ending and result in success, or it can end in tragic failure. And that really is story. Every story has to have these 7 elements. So then how does that then work for marketing? When it comes to marketing, here's the thing is you have to understand what it is that your customer wants. The customer is the hero of the story. So what is it that the customer wants? And that has to be one thing. It can't be 20 things. It has to be one thing. In order to not overwhelm their brains and help them engage in a story that makes sense, they have to want one thing. And then that customer there's something that's getting in the way of that customer getting what they want. The only reason why somebody is coming to you to buy from you, to hire you, is because you solve a problem for them. So you have to identify what is it that the customer, what they want, what's getting in the way of that, what's the problem that's getting in the way. And you have to talk about that problem over and over and over in your marketing, because we do not file brands, personalities, or anything like that based on their branding. Oddly enough, we file in our brain brands and individuals and services and products by the problem they solve, right? So if I say to you, I have my stomach's not feeling great this morning because I ate cold pizza, which I did not, but let's pretend. That wouldn't be out of the ordinary. But I ate cold pizza this morning. My stomach's not doing good. What in your brain can solve that problem? You probably already have in your brain a brand that can solve that problem, right? So Pepto or Pepsid or Tums, right? You like go, oh, you should probably take some of that. But if I told you that I have a headache, you would have a different brand at the top of your brain, right? So you would say Tylenol, Excedrin, Advil, right? You have a different brand. The only context that you think about those brands is in the context of the problem they solve. So as a marketer yourself, because even when you're talking about positioning yourself as a speaker, you are a marketer. You have to identify what problem you solve for your customer. And you have to talk about it all the time in order to brand yourself in their brain as the person who does this. Then ultimately, this is the really big shift in the story brand framework is you are the guide. Your business, your product, which is you, that you are selling, is you are the guide. Your customer is the hero. And you have to figure out how to position yourself as a guide, not the hero of the story, to help your customers overcome their problem. And you do this with 2 things, which we'll talk about a little bit more later: empathy and authority. The only time you should be talking about yourself in your marketing is with empathy and authority to your customers' problems. So you understand their problems because you're like them, and you have helped other people win the day, or you have experience that helps them get what they want. That's it. And then ultimately, you have to show that you have a plan to help them win the day. And then that you have to, in a moment, call them to action Give them, don't just say like, hey, if you have any questions, let me know. No, give them something to accept or reject. Schedule now, schedule a call now, hire me now, book the date now, something that calls people to action quickly so that they have something to accept or reject. And then you have to show them what life is like on the other side after buying your product or service. You have to show them what success looks like for their audience, for them, for their conference. Cast a vision, take people there, help them imagine what that happy ending can look like. And then also you have to show them what the potential tragic results are. So if they don't hire you, what are they missing out on? And you have to say both of those things. Because success, really, we don't have time. Most people just go, well, hire me and you'll get, you'll get this speech or you'll get this talk. Well, and we think that people will then go, well, then that means for their audience, this, and this. They don't have the time or the space to think through that far down the road. So you actually have to show them, once you hire me, your audience will get this talk, which means this. And you have to say it. You have to cast that vision for what a happy ending looks like. And you also have to show them that there are some stakes if they don't. Now, we don't go heavy with the stakes, but in a movie, if I'm running through an airport to disarm a bomb, I'm the hero and I'm running through an airport to disarm a bomb, and all of a sudden I learn that that bomb is full of baby powder, I'm done running, right? I'm not going to pull a hammy to disarm a bomb with baby powder. That's not happening, right? And it's the same with your audience who you are trying to sell to. If there are no consequences for them not purchasing for you, if they're not still going to be struggling with a problem or insecure about what their speaker is going to do, or that they're not going to get kind of practical tips for their audience, if they don't know, if you are not stating those things, then there's no urgency to hire you. There has to be some kind of urgency. So basically what the StoryBrand framework does is it walks through and helps you identify the talking points for all of these 7 elements of story. Once you identify those, you then put them in your marketing. And what that does is it allows you to tell one clear, compelling message that helps people understand why you contribute to their survival and thriving, does so in such a way that doesn't burn any calories, and helps them ultimately experience narrative transportation so that your message then ultimately has greater influence.
Love it. Thank you very, very much, JJ. That was a great question, very thorough answer. And also,
I just kept going.
It was great because you covered pretty much the essence of StoryBrand, all the different elements. And there's a few things I just want to respond to just in terms of listening to you. The first is the whole area of narrative transportation. One of the things that I loved about talking to you before and also listening to you talking about it since is I've studied a lot in the area of neuroscience and storytelling for years. And I know that you've done an entire thesis all about stories. And so all the insights you're getting, it's not like, you're talking about neuroscience or ideas that you've heard someone else. This is actual work that you've done, mining through all the different studies, which again, for me, sort of encapsulates a much greater understanding about it. But like even with narrative transportation, it's fascinating studies that I read recently where they played a certain story for people in different locations and they measured what was going on for them, and they found that their heartbeat and breathing started to sync up with the what they were watching. So as they were watching the story unfold, at the exact same time in, let's say, Tokyo and New York, the same heartbeat aligned for all the different people watching, regardless of where they were in the world. And that just kind of starts to support and back up the concept of narrative transportation and what they call neural coupling, this whole connection we have with other people who are always responding to story. And I think oftentimes when people mention story, it's thrown out everywhere. Everybody's talking about it, but no one's actually talking about it. Everyone says what they're talking about is a story, but these elements that you talked about, these 7 elements, are the building blocks of story. And there's just one other point I wanted to make and then get to the next question. And that is, what I found really simple about this framework is that it's not so that you could tell a great story, because I'm sure every single person on this call, when you're in your gig, you have your signature story. You have that time where you almost died, or the time where you fell in love, or the time where you overcame adversity, and you bring people through, and everyone loves it. But it takes 10 minutes. And what we're talking about is, to your point, JJ, doing it very, very quickly. And there's, on the one hand, there's the one sentence, tagline or suggestion or overall, this is what we do. But on the other hand, you have, how do you, in 20 seconds, 10 seconds, in a paragraph, on one page of the website, how do you communicate that effectively? And that's what these 7 elements do. When you look at it, you can say a sentence almost for each, a sentence or 2 for each. And so what I'd love to do is just on that, could you just share from your own point of view, what are the biggest mistakes you've seen, primarily people like speakers or coaches? What's the biggest mistake you've seen them make, especially when it comes to, let's say, their website? Because I want to take everything you're saying, I want to dig into each, but I want to make it as practical to us as possible, because you've given such an incredible overview. What are the main mistakes you've seen people make when they try to present themselves online, specifically around a website or a profile?
Yeah. So you make a really good point, because when you're speaking, you have a half hour or, an hour to kind of get people's attention. And so a longer story and the in-depth kind of engagement is fantastic, because they've given you that amount of time. People give you between 2 and 3 seconds on your website. That's what the research shows. It's like, depending on which different study you read, it's between 2 and 5. But really, like, the high end that people give of the average is 5 seconds. So you have to be able to communicate so clearly and quickly that people will understand all of the things that we just talked about. And the story framework helps you identify sentences that then you can put on. So a couple mistakes that I think people make a lot is, one, when you are talking about yourself because as speakers, we're selling a product, but we really are the product. And so, it's a lot of times it's like, well, I have to get people to like me. I have to get people to connect with me and all of these things. The way that you're going to get people to like you and connect with you is really the 2 things I talked about that matter in the guide, becoming the guide for your hero. So if your customer is the hero and you want to be the guide, the way you talk about yourself is by using empathy and authority. And that's it. Only empathy and authority, right? So let me give an example from a movie. The only reason a guide matters in a movie is because they have been where the hero has been, so they understand what the hero's going through, and they've already won the day. Those 2 things have to go together. So in Hunger Games, Haymitch he was in the Hunger Games and he won the Hunger Games. So he understands what it's like to have to try to kill children while also being a victor. He's won. That's why he matters in the story. If Katniss wanted to open a bakery, then Haymitch doesn't matter in that story, right? He's just another drunk in the town. He's a side character. But the only reason he matters is because it's Katniss's story. So she's trying to win the Hunger Games. So she needs somebody who's been there and who's won. Same with Star Wars. Luke is trying to figure out who he is and become a Jedi. Well, Obi-Wan Kenobi and Yoda also went through that process, but they've also become master Jedis. So the only reason they matter, again, if Luke is if the story is about him finding love, then they don't matter. So for you, when you're talking about yourself, I think a lot of times people think the way that I endear myself to people is tell fun facts about myself so they can get to know me and feel like they connect. No. If you won the 7th grade 3-point contest when you were in junior high, but you're not teaching about winning a 3-point contest or speaking about winning a 3-point contest, that should not be in your bio. Get it out of your bio. You shouldn't be telling what your favorite ice cream flavor is unless you're speaking on ice cream. Get it out of your bio. Only put things in your bio that directly contribute to what your audience is feeling and what they want to win on. You have to show empathy and authority.
Can I just interrupt you there, JJ, because I think this is an important point, but I'd love to know one of the benefits of putting in that ad hoc information, like you mentioned, about favorite ice cream or whatever, is to try to make it so that you give a little bit more of your personality to make you more unique, to make you stand out. So could you just suggest from your own experience, if you're positioning yourself with authority, but nowadays every Tom, Dick, and Harry can say, "Oh, I'm a bestseller," right? Because it's easier than ever to become a bestseller in some form if you find the right niche in terms of Amazon, right? So how do you maintain that uniqueness, that differentiation, that personal differentiation as a character by sticking to the authority and empathy pieces?
Well, your authority should differentiate. So you want to look for things that are a little bit more unique. So being a best-selling author is you want that in there, and that's okay. Well, let me just say this. The first part you want to do is actually identify what it is that your specific audience wants. And so once you identify, instead of just saying they want a great speaker, what is it that they actually want, right? So and we need to narrow that in. The more narrow you can be on that front end, the better you're going to be able to then position yourself as a guide with uniqueness, right? So what is it, naming, what is it that they're looking for? What do people, and one of the ways you can find this out is, what do people say after I'm done speaking that they got out of this? What is it that they really saw value in? And you start to identify what is your kind of almost niche that you bring in. So that's where you start. Then you bring in the empathy and authority to that specific value and the problem that you solved for people in that process. And so that's kind of where it starts, is identifying what it is that your customers want, that you're trying to sell to specifically, what problems they're experiencing that you can overcome. And then that's when you talk about the empathy and authority. Now, here's the thing, is that when it comes to our brain, again, think in terms of people are giving you right off the bat 3 to 5 seconds, right? That's about it on your website. So people are really only in the beginning looking for a check mark in their brain that you're legitimate. That's it. So having on your page like some media appearances or best-selling author or something like that to start, that's actually, even if a lot of other speakers are doing that, all they're looking for in that moment is a check mark that says you're legit. And so we think we need all this other stuff up front. We don't. You just need a little bit that says this person has done the work and they're going to be able to help us win. That's all you're looking for in the beginning. The other thing I would say is that when you're competing in the marketplace as a speaker, it's a very crowded marketplace, obviously, right? The ones who can communicate the clearest on the front end of what they offer and what problems they solve for their audience are going to win out in the marketplace. Clarity is going to beat cute and clever every day. So when you start like adding all of this stuff in your bio and talking about things that don't really ultimately matter to their story, then what happens is people get distracted and start thinking about those other things. Like they literally start thinking about their own favorite ice cream flavor. And unless you match exactly, then it actually doesn't create a sense of empathy, right? They start thinking about their ice cream and then they start going, well, I need to take my kids. I should probably pick them up. It would be fun to go to ice cream. And they're gone. They're out, completely out, because they're starting to think about that, or they're starting to Google other things. Literally what you've told them is go away from my page and go away from me and start thinking about other things. So here's just a little example is my life has been, somebody wrote in there, they're like, I'm a hybrid human because I've done in the chat. Somebody's like, I'm a hybrid human because I've done all these things. What's funny is I didn't really tell you all of the things, because I only spoke to the things that actually contribute to my authority in this space. So I talked about being a professor, I talked about being a nonprofit, and I talked about being in Hollywood and writing stories. That and creating kind of TV and film. That's it. I didn't mention that at one point I was a pastor. I didn't mention that at one point I was a dancer in a Missy Elliott music video. I didn't mention I was on The Office. Now, all of those things make me interesting, right? And may have created a space where you like were intrigued about my story, right? Because that's me telling my story. But what I actually told you in my bio when I started talking was your story. I told you you wanted to be somebody who understands story, who connects with audiences. And I gave you only my authority in that space. And then I don't know if you heard me also give you a little empathy where I was like, hey, when I became a marketer, I really struggled to try to create these messages. Right. I literally only gave it's not sneaky. It's just giving you the information that helps you process in a way that you can understand and says, this is your story, and I'm the person who's going to help you win the day. That's it. Now, if I was teaching you about how to be an extra on TV shows, then I wouldn't tell you about being a professor. I would only tell you about the TV shows that I've been on. That's it. Right? I'm only speaking to you about the things that matter to your journey and helping you win.
And so one of the things that I love about the empathy and authority piece and this relevancy piece, like it's the difference between being interesting versus being relevant, right?
Yes.
What I love is that oftentimes when you're talking about building websites, you say, look, if you've got event planners on your website versus, let's say, corporate, HR directors or CEOs that are going to hire you, you should be looking at two different pages. And the event planner's page should be focusing on what is the problem you're trying to solve for event planner. Because an event planner is not necessarily looking to be able to ensure the organization communicates more effectively with each other or ensure that everyone is able to manage stress better. What they're more than likely going to be interested in is, how can I find a speaker that brings value, that adds a lot of value, that everyone will walk away going, that was amazing. They were entertained, they were inspired, and they were impacted by it. Whereas if you're talking to a HR person, then they need to know, okay, well, we're really talking more about problems here, but it's also what authority is relevant for them, what problem is relevant for them. So with that in mind, JJ, could you talk a little bit about the problem? Because I think that's an interesting, you go in a little bit more depth into it and how to address that specifically, if you can, like on something like a website or on a social media post. What are the three different elements or three different types of problems? If you could share that with us, that would be amazing.
Yeah. So one thing you just kind of said is in some places when you're a speaker, it is hard. This is what I want to acknowledge. It's hard because you essentially have two audiences, right? You have the audience of like the event planners and the CEOs and people like that who are actually paying your salary. And then you have the end user, the audience who you actually speak to, that are also your customers, right? So when you're creating messaging, what you're ultimately doing is in some ways, you're creating it for, like when you're getting really niche and specific, you're creating it for the final audience, right? What is the audience going to get out of this? So essentially, like that's when you're talking about, let's say you were somebody who, I'll give an example of a person. I ultimately, one of the speakers that impacted me the most in my life, actually, oddly enough, was this woman who I just kind of happened to see at a conference, she wrote a book called Forgiving the Dead Man Walking. And the movie Dead Man Walking, she was the victim of the person who Sean Penn, like the serial killer, essentially, and she was the one who put him away. And her whole speech was about how do you actually walk in forgiveness with somebody who kidnapped, raped, and murdered your boyfriend, and her, like kidnapped and raped her and kept her for like 6 days, and then also murdered her boyfriend and all this stuff. Anyway, so she was walking through how to forgive, right? So the audience ultimately is going to learn how to keep moving forward with forgiveness. But the people who hired her have to understand how that ultimately is going to make them look in this. So when you're creating your audience profile and everything, you have to obviously look at how is it going to impact this final audience, and then also interpret that for the audience who is actually paying your bills. So focus on this message of what is it that when I speak, what is the problem that these people are experiencing, that after they hear me, they're going to have some tools, stories, information to move forward. And then what will that mean also then for the people who are paying your check, right? So people will understand how to move forward with forgiveness, which means that then you're actually going to have a workplace where people get along better, that ultimately they can solve conflict, right? So you have to name this and then also say what that then will mean for success look like for the people who are hiring you. So that's one thing. Is people will ask, do you just talk to CEOs, or do you talk to the show like how you differentiate for your final audience? I tend to go with the final audience as the main character, and then ultimately interpret that for the people who will be paying your paycheck. So that's one thing. But when it comes to problems specifically, what you're looking for is basically saying, what is it that these people are experiencing that I can help them overcome, right? And so when you're talking about CEOs, or you are talking about what is the main problem, is that like your team isn't getting along, your team is not communicating well, which ultimately means that's holding you back, right? So that's the problem people are experiencing. And you're just naming that in your marketing. And that then tells people that you can overcome that. So sorry, my mind is kind of, I'm jumping around, but let me back up and answer your actual question. So your actual question was, what are the 3 different levels of problem? So in a movie, in a screenplay, in a book, the story begins, like I said, with an external problem. There's something that's getting in the way that the hero has to overcome in order to get what they want. And we can name that. So there's a bomb that's going to go off. There's a tornado that's coming into town. Their daughter has been kidnapped for the 7th time, Liam Neeson. And you're dealing with all of these things, right? There's a problem that has to be overcome. But and that's called an external problem. But screenwriters use a trick. And what it's called is the internal problem. So you and I would bet almost everybody on this call, we've never had to disarm a bomb or fly to Europe to fight terrorists who've kidnapped our daughter, right? Like, we've not had to experience that external problem. And so in order to connect with an audience, screenwriters tap into the internal problem. So the internal problem is always something that the external problem is bringing up in the main character. So let's say like the main character is going to disarm a bomb, but the last time they disarmed a bomb, they cut the wrong wire and it killed their dad, right? So they feel like a bad son. They don't feel like they have what it takes. They're insecure, right? Or again, like Liam Neeson, his daughter gets kidnapped and he feels guilty for being a bad father who wasn't there, and he's trying to overcome that internal guilt, right? So the internal problem is always really what drives the actual story. The external problem has to be there, but the internal problem drives the story. And so when you're identifying the problem for your character, for your customers, when you're naming that, what problem you solve, you have to name the external problem, but then you actually have to also name the internal problem that you solve for people as well. Here's why this is important. If my lawn, I'm looking out my window, if my lawn is overgrown, that is an external problem. However, the only reason why I would hire somebody to fix that is if I'm embarrassed or overwhelmed, right? If I'm not embarrassed by the fact that my lawn is overgrown, or I'm not overwhelmed by that, or I'm not stressed out by it, I'm not hiring anybody to fix it. It's just going to sit there because it doesn't actually create an internal problem for me. But if I'm stressed and overwhelmed, now I need to hire somebody to fix that quickly. So people often go shopping to solve external problems, but they buy to solve internal problems. So you want to be able to articulate both, right? What do you solve? Like, can you name what you solve for people externally, the external problem? People don't have enough time, or people struggle with, time management, or they struggle with relationship. That's all external problem. But when they don't have good time management, or when they struggle with relationship, how does that make them feel? That's the internal problem. And so if people struggle with relationship, they feel insecure. So when you give the tips and tricks that you're going to offer, or the stories that you share in your talk, you are not only helping them get better relationships, you're helping them feel more secure. And that is actually ultimately more powerful than the external problem. So you want to identify both. And then the third level of problem is called a philosophical. And in movies, it's really kind of the theme of the movie, right? Like, so in Star Wars, it's like good versus evil. And the movie is actually making an argument for a way the world should be, right? Ultimately, independence should triumph over tyranny, or good should triumph over evil. Um, in a love story, it's love should conquer all. It's trying to make some kind of philosophical argument. And so in your marketing, you want to understand that the world is essentially for your customer unfair and not right. It's just plain wrong. There's something that's just plain wrong. And you want to make a statement that says something along the lines of you deserve, you ought, you should. And when you can make that kind of statement, you're actually tapping into what's called a philosophical problem. So you're saying, you deserve to have the tools you need, or you should be able to, or you ought to, or understanding this will give you, and you're basically creating some kind of statement that says you deserve, ought, or should. And when you do that, you're helping people enter into a philosophical understanding of the story, and helping that will help them engage in more narrative transportation. So when you're identifying your problems, you're identifying the external problem you solve, the internal problem you solve, and the philosophical problem you solve. And I'm giving you kind of a very high level overview, but we do workshops where you can come and actually spend 2 days with us going through this process with a coach, that we kind of walk you through and help you create all of this. So
love it, and I just I'll second and recommend very much so the workshop. It's phenomenal, as are your books, Marketing Made Simple, and Building a Story Brand. I think there's one other thing I wanted to ask JJ, if that's okay. Have you got a few minutes?
Yeah, totally.
So I wanted to ask about, extraordinarily useful from a website point of view, from a communication point of view. What about funnels, right? So one of the things I know I've heard you and Don talk about is being able to make it so that you build, let's say, what you call nurturing campaigns, as well as sales campaigns, and how to get people into, let's say, your funnel and then work through. I'd love if you could talk about building this sort of sales funnel, building those relationships with through email, and also anything on social media perspective. If there's any just best practice tips for us as speakers to market ourselves through email and also through social media, I'd love it if you could share some more about that.
Yeah, so the highest level of the funnel, what you're really doing is getting email addresses and contacts, right? So you can do this on social media, you can do this on your website, you can do this in webinars, all this different stuff. What you want to do at that highest level is position yourself as the guide. So that's really the main thing, is positioning yourself as the guide. And the way you do that is through empathy and authority to your customers' problems. So you have the ability to solve your customers' problems, you understand them. So that means you need to constantly be talking about your customers' problems. So on social media, in lead generation, in lead generating PDFs or videos you're putting out there, what you want to do is really identify and name your customer's problem. So, and then give them value that helps them on their journey of solving those problems. So, a lot of you probably already do this. Like, if I was 5 tips that are going to save you money, or 5 tips that are going to help you avoid pain, anything like that, what that does is it positions you with authority, and specifically positions you in the niche of your market that you can solve these people's problems. So for instance, if I was going to just create social media posts or lead generation for you guys, this audience right here, I might say 5 mistakes that speakers make that are costing them bigger audience, that are keeping them from speaking to bigger audiences, something like that, right? So I might put that on social media. I might do a video about that. And what that's going to do is what you want is to get to bigger audiences, and you're making some mistake. There's a problem that's in your way. So I'm going to show you how to solve that problem. And then you are going to then trust me. And so what ultimately we'll do is, if I do that on social media or with a lead generating PDF or on Facebook ads or anything like that, you're going to download that, you're going to connect with that. then you'll give me your email address, and then ultimately I'm going to follow up with a sales funnel that gets you to buy my product or service. So for you, as you're, identifying, if you are speaking specifically to CEOs, then you want to give CEOs value that shows that you have authority in this space, that can solve a small problem for them along the way, can relieve some stress, give them value, so that then they begin trusting you as their guide. They go to your website, they get follow-up emails from you, and ultimately then you are going to sell. And that's kind of how, I know we're running out of time, but that's like the most general, as I would say, on social media, on your lead generation. What you want to think about is talking to your customer specifically, name the problem that they are having, give them value to overcome that problem, and continue positioning yourself with authority and empathy in that space.
Great, perfect, excellent. Thank you so much for that. Has anybody, if you've got a couple of minutes, JJ, or are you tight? You've stopped. Brilliant.
I'm good.
Let's just open it up to questions if we can, and then I'll give a basic summary of what we covered, and I might have one or two myself. But if anyone's any questions, would love to just stick up your hand. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. But would anyone like to ask JJ anything at all? Gene, our illustrious president. Gene, fire away.
Great. JJ, thank you so much for being here. We overlap in our backgrounds in fundraising and politics, so I perked up when I heard you say that.
Yeah.
And I love what you said about the things we keep from our descriptions of ourselves, because I've found over the years, when I would say improv, people would actually get lost in this lane of, I once took a class, my next door neighbor's best friend's nephew took a class, and I went to a show, and yes, and suddenly this huge surge of feedback. You so articulately, effectively used the story bit to describe a great improv scene. Can you tell me what your relationship is with the use of the word improv in your own introduction and growth as a speaker and presenter, and how you've transformed that?
Well, I actually did. I toured and did improv for about 3 years professionally, and so I actually one of my careers was did improv comedy, and so a lot of that has to do with some of the things I've taken that into speaking and marketing in particular is really the listening piece, like listening to your audience versus I think most people when they go on stage, if you're a bad improviser, is you have an idea of where you're headed and you try to force that forward. And in good improv is actually about listening to the scene and letting the scene create itself. And that's kind of taking that back to the marketing piece is I think a lot of us try to go, here's what I'm good at and here's what I'm going to do. And so I'm going to make myself and puff myself up. And in reality, what we need to do is be listening to the audience and hear what they say, what value we bring and what problems we solve, because then all we need to do is articulate that back to them. Right, in our marketing. And instead of saying, I'm great at this, and not that anybody on here is saying I am the best speaker in the world and but we feel like we have to puff ourselves up in order to stand out in the crowd. And you don't. You need to listen to your audience and hear them say, this is the story that you helped me win. You have to position, even when you're speaking, your audience is Luke Skywalker and you're Yoda. In your marketing, the audience is Luke Skywalker and you're Yoda. So your job as a speaker is not to be impressive. It's to help them win. And when you help them win, you will be impressive. Right? You'll get that as a second piece. But I think that's like in improv, horrible improv people try to be impressive when they get on stage. But if you're actually trying to create a great scene that is fun and collaborative, then you're going to be impressive. And I think that's kind of in your marketing and speaking, if you can approach it from that way of not trying to drive your own story, but actually listen to your customer's story and speak that back to them, you will be memorable, you will be impressive. But if you try to be impressive, it won't work. Oops, you're on mute, I think.
There you go. Thank you so much for that, JJ. I would love to see any other Any other questions? Can we see everybody? Anyone else want to throw in, or will I ask another? Very, very thoughtful audience. Let's see if that's a comment. Oh yeah, what's the best speaker website you've ever seen, JJ? Or have you got a great example of?
I would not say that I do. I don't know, to be honest. I'd have to think about that.
Or entrepreneur, even if you have like a coach or entrepreneur or someone that, their services and what they do.
Honestly,
so it's like it's like being asked what your favorite movie is. You know what I mean? You're like, oh.
Yeah, exactly. To be honest, I don't know. There's a million of them out there.
What do you look for when you look at, like, let's say, for example, you were looking at a website right now. What do you look for? Like, what is there, like a checklist you have in your head that might help? Like, is there something you go, okay, when you see the website, yeah, because I know that you analyze them all the time, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. And now I really make buying decisions based on this, because it makes me mad if people can't market well. Then I'm like, I don't trust you. So the main thing that I'm looking for in the header of the website. So the header is the first section people see when they come to your website. That should be, you should answer 3 questions in the header. And 3 questions are, what do you do? How does it make my life better? And how do I get it? That should be answered in your header. And so you should basically say, like, and so if you're not saying that you are a speaker, then don't just say like, grow your team and get everybody on board. Because then I don't know, are you a consultant? Are you a speaker? What are you? And so be really, really clear about that, so people don't have to burn any calories to understand. So you want almost like 2 lines, right? Like the headline of your website and then a subheader. And either one can be this way, the subheader or headline, but one of them has to be exactly clear what you do. So, a world-renowned speaker who helps people build their teams. I mean, just that, like, so it's very clear. And then the other line should be what people will get out of it. So what value do you bring? How do you make my life better? So in that case, you might say, grow your team and grow your business. If you were a team building kind of speaker. If you were an inspirational speaker, it might say something like, be inspired to live your best self, or be inspired. But most people stop with that, like, how does it make my life better? And then they don't actually say what they do. You need to have both. So how do you make people's life better? Kind of this aspirational kind of, and a lot of it is even very vague and very like high level and inspirational. And then also specifically what you do. So if you do conferences, conventions, private workshops, anything like that, put it on there. Make it clear so people don't have to burn any calories. And then have a direct call to action. So how do they get it? Do they book you? Do they call you? Do they schedule an appointment? What do they do to get it? 70% of small businesses do not have a strong call to action in their header. That's it. And that's one of the biggest ways that you're going to drop business. People need to know how to hire you. So those 3 things, that's what I'm looking for in a header. If I go on there and I have to ask any questions that can't be answered by those, what do you do? How does it make my life better? And how do I get it? If I have to ask those questions, like, well, what do you mean by that or something? Then I'm out. I won't buy from that person.
Also, I noticed on websites that you recommend, it's usually like, put the problems that you're solving, like the StoryBrand method itself. It's like, have the problems right underneath that. When you're
exactly.
Once you've grabbed the attention, then you want to be able to talk about what they give a shit about. Because I remember years ago, I would have my own website, and my justification was, well, if they go to my website, they already know, they just want to know about me. They already know what I do, and that was a dumb mistake. And then I changed it and shifted it, because even if they already have heard about you, they still don't care about you. They care about how you can solve their problem. So would it be fair to say the next piece is digging into the problems then?
Yep, that's exactly what we usually recommend. Header answers those first 3 questions, and then the next section, you go into what problems you solve, or just talking about those problems. So you can either do something like asking questions. Are you looking for, does your team struggle with, are you worried about, just asking those kind of questions. or just naming the problem. Like if you're, say, an inspirational speaker and you want to say something like, so many people right now are living their life in a way that doesn't feel fulfilling. They're being held back by their insecurities and their struggles, right? So you're just naming the problem. So before, up top, you would have said, you're going to be inspired to live your best self. And then you go into the problem. So you literally say, we have too many people this day who are just like walking through life like zombies, and we're tired of it, especially during the pandemic when people don't feel connected. They don't feel da-da-da, right? So you just name it and then go, my talk solves that. I mean, so you're really just identifying the problem and then just giving like I can actually help people overcome this.
And then I presume then that's when you get into the empathy and authority piece, and then you go into the plan. Here's the 3 steps or that kind of thing. In a nutshell, is that the basic structure of an overall web page?
Exactly. Once you identify those sentences, you create those 7 elements, those 7 talking points, really. And it's just a few words or sentences. Then you're just plugging that into your website. And you can expand on it a little bit and kind of get a little bit more creative, but always start with the clarity. Don't start with cute and clever. Start with clarity and then make it cute and clever. If you try to be cute and clever first, you're going to miss clarity.
Great, wonderful. Thank you very much for that. And again, if anyone wants some good examples, obviously visit the StoryBrand website, because they their website demonstrates it, as does businessmadesimple.com. And also, if you go to StoryBrand website, you can also find their certified guides. And those guides, if you check their websites out, they're going to have examples of websites as professional service providers, as coaches or guides. So you're going to see lots of examples there as well. So there's tons. I've done that myself. I've gone through a lot of the guides, just looking at how they present themselves using the StoryBrand framework, and it's definitely helpful. So I hope that answers your question, Anne. Just to bring everything to a conclusion, and again, if I miss out on anything important, JJ, let me know. We started off by talking about the importance of why story works in the brain, and how the brain works is basically it needs to survive and thrive. And in order to survive and thrive, it has to figure out ways to be able to solve problems. In doing so, it consumes a lot of calories. Our brain, I think, it consumes about 20% of the calories that our body takes in every day. And therefore, it finds shortcuts, fast ways to be able to figure out how to solve them. Therefore, clarity is crucial. As JJ just mentioned, it's so important to be clear as opposed to cute. Clarity always comes before cute, and it's really vital to make it as simple as possible. But also, stories provide you with a wonderful vehicle to demonstrate that clarity, but in a more impactful way. JJ talked about narrative transportation and how we're impacted so much by stories that it affects our neurochemistry, on our neurology. The way in which our brains work is that as we start to process a story, we start to become in sync with that story. And again, 2 people in totally different places at the same point in the story will oftentimes have the same physiological responses. So stories bring people together, unify your audience, and impact them emotionally in that powerful way. Then JJ talked about the structure of the different elements. So we started with a character who has an objective desire that they want. And this objective that they have starts them moving towards a journey. But then there's a problem that gets in the way and stops them from solving it. They then turn to a guide that helps them. And then they're able to make it so that the guide gives them a plan, which they're able to execute, a call to action where they need to take the steps to be able to execute things. And then they get results. And the results can either be wonderful, amazing results, or a terrible tragedy if they don't execute on the plan, for example. So again, you're emphasizing the importance of stakes. And then JJ explained that it's really important to make sure that you bring the customer through that. So the customer is always the hero. You, as the speaker, is the guide, helping them to be able to solve whatever problem your niche is, whatever you specialize in. And again, providing them with a plan. This is how we work together. This is what you need to do. And giving them the call to action of here's how to book me, like book me now today, or schedule time for a discovery call or whatnot. And then emphasizing the results. These are the kinds of things, having pictures of your website of all these smiling, happy faces, standing ovations, whatnot. And then on the flip side, creating images of people looking despondent. I'm only joking about the flip side. You wouldn't have pictures like that on your website. But you might emphasize, some of the things that people, mistakes people make when they book speakers, whatnot. Then we talked about the 2 qualities that you need to position yourself as having. That's empathy and authority. And they're the only 2 things that matter. A lot of the other extra stuff is just noise. We want to lean into how do you position yourself with a massive amount of authority in your space, face, which is relevant, not interesting, but relevant. And then also making sure that you empathize. Empathy is about making it so that you show, I get you, I understand what you're struggling with, and authority is, and I can help you in that way. And then we talked about the 3 types of problems. So the external problem, which is the problem that you can see and you can point to and you can label. The internal problem is what you're struggling with internally in terms of your feelings as a result of that, the frustration, the stress, whatnot. And then there's the philosophical problem, why we shouldn't be experiencing this kind of problem in our lives and why it's time for us to overcome it. Again, thinking through how you would put that together if you're a speaker and if you're talking to event planners or CEOs, or even the audience themselves. Again, JJ recommends always design your stories for the audience and then work backwards and make sure that you interpret it for the CEO or for the event planner. And then last but not least, we touched on a couple of things. JJ talked about improv and how he sees that and how he uses that on a continuous basis. And then finally, we talked about a website. So the core questions we want to ask in the header. As soon as people go to your website, they've, as JJ mentioned, 2 or 3 seconds before they decide to move on, they very, very quickly will make a decision. And you need to, in that one sentence, say, what do you do? How can you improve their life? And how can they get that? So it's number 1, what is it that they do? Number 2, what difference will it make to them? And number 3, how can they work with you, or how can they get you to speak at their event? Very simply, in a very quick call to action. And then underneath that, that's when you go into the problems. Again, you can go the external, internal, philosophical. You can pose them as questions, or you can even name them and relate to them. And then underneath that, then you will go into positioning, why you're the guide for them, empathy and authority. Then you go into the plan of how to work with them, and so on and so forth. Overall, JJ, it's been extraordinarily valuable, as it always is. Really appreciate you doing an incredible job today. And I know I, for one, always get new nuggets of wisdom from it. Could you just share with everyone, from your own point of view, what people should do if they want to learn more? Obviously, you've got an incredible 2-day course. You also have the incredible books. Could you share with everyone how they can learn more if they want to do some work with you?
Yeah, so there's 2 books. One is Building a Story Brand, and that really helps you clarify your message, create those messaging points. And then Marketing Made Simple takes those messaging points and shows you how to create lead generators, websites, and emails. So it's kind of, one is clarify your message, one is create your marketing. And then we cover that in 2 different spaces. Like if you actually want to go in depth, like almost take college courses on it. One is called BMS, Business Made Simple. So you can go to businessmadesimple.com, and there's 2 online courses that walk you through that. Or if you're interested in going through it with a coach, somebody who actually will help you kind of articulate and get it in tight and make sure you're doing it right, then we do a 2-day workshop. I think the next one's coming up either end of January, beginning of February, and you can go to storybrand.com and register there. So the 2 days will actually ultimately, it will help you clarify everything, show you what you need to put your marketing, and the work you'll do in 2 days will save you, I think, years of work with it. So
super. Thank you so much, JJ. Really appreciate it, as always. And I do highly recommend all of those. I've been lucky enough to attend the 2-day workshop. I've read the books. I've joined the online Business Made Simple, and I've watched all the trainings there. So definitely a big fan of the work you do. Keep doing great work. And again, thank you so much for taking the time today, my friend.
No problem. And just let me close my point with this. Here's the thing: is that, as somebody who really did struggle with, I marketed myself for a while as a speaker and an author. I did kind of both of those things. And I do think for me, it was always hard to feel like, how do I puff myself up without wanting to puff myself up, right? Because when you're selling yourself, it's hard. And when you can really nail this down and identify that your customer is the hero, your audience is the hero, and I just get to be their guide, for me, that lifted so much weight off my shoulder and also made me so much more effective in what I did. So I hope that this is a gift that can help you kind of do that, lift some of that weight off, and then also help you continue being even more effective in what you're doing.
Love it. Look, lots of notes being taken there. I see it. Thanks, Kate. Brilliant. Again, could everyone just give JJ a round of applause for amazing? We would give you a standing ovation, but then you just see all our navels, JJ, so that wouldn't be good. All right, listen, thank you so much. And best of luck in the future.